At 4:30 in the afternoon on July 28, 2026, the ground beneath southern Japan tore open without warning. A shopping mall's second floor collapsed onto the people inside it. Roads split apart. Trains stopped mid-track. And within minutes, the entire island of Kyushu was holding its breath, waiting to find out whether the worst had already happened or was still coming. Here is what is actually confirmed by Japanese authorities, emergency services, and independent news agencies on the ground. No speculation. The real story is frightening enough on its own. The quake struck Kumamoto Prefecture on Japan's southern main island of Kyushu at roughly 4:30 p.m. local time. Japan's meteorological agency measured it at magnitude 7.1. The U.S. Geological Survey initially reported the same figure before revising it down to 6.8. That gap isn't a mystery or a cover-up. It's a measurement difference. Japan's agency reads the shaking from seismographs planted directly across the islands, right on top of the fault. The American agency calculates the same event from sensors scattered across the globe, using a different model. A few tenths of a point of disagreement is normal. What matters more than the exact number is what Japan's intensity scale showed on the ground. Shindo 7, the highest level that scale goes. That's not a measure of the earthquake's total energy. It's a direct reading of how violently the ground moved where people were standing. In parts of Kumamoto, it hit the very top of the chart. The quake was shallow, only about 10 kilometers deep. Shallow earthquakes are the ones that hurt the most because the energy has almost no distance to travel and no rock layers to absorb the shock before it reaches the surface. A magnitude 7 quake at 10 kilometers deep hits like a hammer. The same magnitude at 100 kilometers down might barely be felt at all. This one was about as close to the surface as a major earthquake gets. The single worst scene of the disaster unfolded at the Aeon Mall in Kushima Town. Multiple witnesses reported hearing what sounded like an explosion during or right after the shaking, along with white smoke rising from the building. Then the second floor came down. Local police told Japanese broadcasters that a significant number of people were killed at the mall alone. In the earliest hours, confirmed reports put at least 2 dead at the site, both women in their 20s, with rescue crews working through the rubble for an unknown number of others still trapped. As search operations continued, the wider death toll across the region climbed into the double digits, with dozens more injured, and officials warning the number could still rise as crews reach areas they haven't been able to search yet. A tsunami advisory went out almost immediately after the shaking stopped, covering the seas along the western coasts of Kumamoto and 3 neighboring prefectures, with officials predicting waves up to 1 meter. Japan's prime minister posted a direct warning telling residents along the coastline to move away from the shore immediately. For close to 2 hours that warning held, and coastal communities evacuated on instinct built from decades of drills. Then, having found no dangerous wave building offshore, the agency lifted the advisory. Unlike the catastrophic tsunami-driven disasters Japan has lived through before, this quake stayed a land event. The danger came from the shaking itself and from what the shaking knocked loose, not from the sea. And it knocked plenty loose. Roads across the region buckled and cracked open, some directly along the path of the fault, torn apart in a way that made clear exactly where the ground had ripped. Store signs collapsed onto sidewalks. Stone walls at the centuries-old Kumamoto castle sustained fresh damage, echoing what happened to that same castle back in 2016. Homes came down, a chimney fell at a paper factory, a train derailed at Yatsushiro Station. Kyushu's entire rail network, including the high-speed Shinkansen bullet trains, was suspended across the board for emergency safety inspections. The runway at Kumamoto Airport was closed, with officials saying at the time there was no timeline for reopening it. Tens of thousands of households lost power in the immediate aftermath, and mobile networks in parts of the region went down right when people needed them most, right when families were trying to reach each other to confirm everyone was safe. Japan's nuclear regulator moved fast. Nearby facilities, including plants at Sendai, Genkai, and Ikata, were all inspected in the hours after the quake, and officials reported no abnormalities at any of them. That single piece of news mattered enormously because Japan understands better than almost any country on Earth what can happen when a major earthquake compromises a nuclear facility. This time, the safeguards held. The Defense Ministry sent aircraft to survey the damage from above, feeding real-time information back to disaster response teams on the ground. While crews from the Fire and Disaster Management Agency worked through collapsed structures searching for survivors, officials urged residents to stay alert for landslides in the hilly terrain around Kumamoto, where saturated or loosened ground can give way well after the shaking itself has stopped. Here's the part officials want people to understand most urgently. This is very likely not finished. A planning official with Japan's meteorological agency told reporters that the shallow nature of the earthquake was actively triggering ongoing seismic activity in the area, and urged residents to stay especially cautious over the following 2 to 3 days. Aftershocks were already registering in the hours afterward, some strong enough to be felt clearly on their own. When a fault this size ruptures, it rarely releases all its stress in one clean break. It settles unevenly, and smaller ruptures along the same fault, sometimes on nearby faults, nudged by the redistributed pressure, can keep firing for days or even weeks. None of that guarantees a bigger quake is coming. Most of the time, aftershocks simply fade out on their own, but officials aren't taking that outcome for granted, and neither should the people living through it. To understand why this hit so hard, and why it's not entirely a shock that it hit here, you have to go back a decade. In April 2016, Kumamoto was struck by a sequence of major earthquakes. It started with two strong foreshocks, magnitude 6.2 and 6.0, which alone killed 9 people and injured about 800. Less than 2 days later, a magnitude 7 main shock struck the same area, killing around 50 people and injuring more than 2,000. Roughly 12,000 houses were destroyed or damaged. A historic bridge collapsed entirely into the river below it. Kumamoto Castle, a national symbol with roots going back over 400 years, suffered heavy structural damage that took years and enormous cost to repair. For many people in this region, the 2016 sequence is still the reference point for what a truly bad earthquake looks like. Now, almost exactly 10 years later, the same general area has been struck again, hard enough to bring down a shopping mall and put Shindo 7 back on the map. That 10-year gap isn't a coincidence in any mystical sense. It comes down to basic, well-understood physics. Kyushu sits in one of the most tectonically active regions on the planet, where multiple plates and fault systems meet and grind against each other. Faults build up stress slowly, year after year, as the plates keep ping. When a big quake finally releases that stress, it doesn't necessarily release all of it. Sometimes a fault ruptures only partially, leaving pressure locked in place. Seismologists studying the 2016 sequence have long noted that not every segment of that fault system fully let go. That leftover strain doesn't vanish. It sits there quietly building again until something gives. This new earthquake may represent exactly that, the same broader fault network finishing what it started in 2016. Japan, as a whole, has had an extraordinarily active stretch of seismic activity over the past several months. This new Kumamoto quake comes barely a month after 2 major earthquakes rattled Venezuela on the other side of the world. And it follows a string of smaller but still significant quakes that have been shaking Japan itself in recent weeks, part of a broader pattern of elevated seismic activity across the country going back to late 2025. None of that means every one of those earthquakes is directly connected in a simple cause and effect chain. Japan sits atop 4 tectonic plates at once, with more active fault zones than almost anywhere else on Earth. And some level of ongoing seismic activity is simply the country's BA Celine. But add up the frequency and size of recent quakes nationwide, and it paints a picture of a landscape under real, sustained tectonic pressure right now. And this Kumamoto event is the most destructive expression of that pressure so far. What almost certainly kept the toll from climbing much higher is something Japan has spent decades and enormous national resources building: earthquake-resistant infrastructure and relentless public preparedness. Japanese building codes are among the strictest on Irno. Haiti, precisely because the country has no choice but to take this threat seriously. Buildings are engineered to flex and absorb shaking rather than shatter under it. Children in Japanese schools run earthquake drills the same routine way children elsewhere run fire drills, so that when the ground actually starts moving, the response is closer to instinct than panic. That preparation is exactly why, even with a Shindo 7 earthquake and a partial mall collapse, Japan isn't looking at a death toll in the thousands the way some countries have suffered from earthquakes of similar or even smaller magnitude. It's also worth being clear about where the real danger in Japanese earthquakes usually comes from. The most catastrophic disaster in the country's modern history, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, was devastating primarily because of the wave that followed, not the shaking itself. This Kumamoto quake, mercifully, did not produce that kind of wave. The danger here came entirely from the ground itself and from what it broke. Japan sits at the meeting point of 4 major tectonic plates: the Pacific, the Philippine Sea, the Eurasian, and the North American, an overlap found almost nowhere else on the planet. Kyushu specifically sits above a subduction zone, where the Philippine Sea plate is being forced down and under the rest of Japan, grinding against the crust above it millimeter by millimeter, year after year. That grinding doesn't happen smoothly. The rock locks together at points along the fault, resisting the motion the plates are trying to make, and stress quietly builds at those locked points for years or decades. Eventually, the accumulated stress exceeds what the rock can hold, and it slips all at once. That sudden slip is what an earthquake actually is, not a mysterious eruption of energy from nowhere, but the physical release of years of patiently accumulated mechanical strain all at once, along a line in the crust. Seismologists analyzing the rupture pattern determined it behaved as a strike-slip fault with a small amount of extensional motion, meaning the 2 sides of the fault mostly slid sideways past each other. It's the same basic type of motion, famously associated with California's San Andreas Fault. It's also worth being honest about what officials still don't know in the first hours and days after an event like this. The precise final death toll takes time, sometimes days, to confirm, because search and rescue teams have to physically clear collapsed structures before anyone can say with confidence how many people were inside. Damage assessments for homes, roads, and infrastructure across an entire prefecture take even longer, often weeks. And predicting exactly what happens next, whether the aftershock sequence simply tapers off, or whether a larger rupture is still building somewhere along the same system, is something even Japan's sophisticated monitoring network can't answer with certainty. What agencies can offer, and did offer here, are probability-based aftershock forecasts. There's a bigger question worth sitting with. How does a country live generation after generation, on top of this much geological instability, and still function as one of the safest, most orderly places on Earth during a disaster? Part of the answer is cultural as much as it is engineering. Japanese schoolchildren don't just hear about earthquakes once a year in a lesson. They physically practice the sequence, dropping under a desk, covering the head and neck, moving calmly toward exits once the shaking stops, checking on neighbors, walking rather than running, until it becomes closer to muscle memory than conscious decision-making. Public buildings, train stations, and work places run regular drills built around that same choreography. Emergency broadcast systems push alerts to phones within seconds of a quake's first detection, giving people a few extra seconds to step away from a window or get under something sturdy before the strongest shaking arrives. None of that erases the human tragedy still playing out at that Kumamoto Mall, and none of it makes the coming days of aftershocks any less frightening for the people living through them. But it's the reason a country that gets hit this hard, this often, keeps finding a way to absorb the blow and rebuild rather than being permanently broken by it. There's one more scientifically documented connection worth understanding, and it has nothing to do with speculation. It's the relationship between large earthquakes and nearby volcanoes. Kyushu is home to some of Japan's most active volcanic systems, including Sakurajima, one of the most consistently active volcanoes on Earth, and Mount Aso, whose caldera sits not far from this earthquake's epicenter. Volcanologists have long documented that a powerful earthquake can, in some cases, physically disturb the underground magma systems feeding a nearby volcano. Seismic waves traveling through the crust can jostle magma chambers and the conduits connecting them to the surface, potentially destabilizing dissolved gases, and, in some historical cases, triggering or accelerating volcanic activity day, weeks, or even months after a major quake. This isn't guaranteed. Most large earthquakes near volcanoes don't trigger an eruption at all, but it's documented well enough across decades of global seismic records that scientists will be watching Kyushu's volcanoes especially closely in the days and weeks ahead as a standard, evidence-based part of post-earthquake hazard monitoring. The evacuation and warning response deserves a closer look because it demonstrates infrastructure most countries simply don't have. Within moments of the shaking being detected, Japan's nationwide earthquake early warning system, which uses the faster, weaker initial waves to estimate an earthquake's size and location before the slower, more destructive waves arrive, pushed alerts across the region. In a shallow, near-epicenter earthquake like this one, that warning window is often only a few seconds, sometimes less, simply because the source is so close. But even those seconds mattered. Enough time for someone to step back from a window, for a surgeon to pause a procedure, for a train operates, or to begin an automatic braking sequence. Part of why Shinkansen services across Kyushu were able to halt safely and be inspected before any train was allowed to move again, rather than continuing to run at high speed through a region still shaking with aftershocks. Reports out of Kumamoto in the hours after the quake described a familiar, grim pattern. Elderly residents in older homes, some predating the stricter building codes introduced after past disasters, were among those most at risk from structural collapse. The local shelters were opened quickly across the prefecture, a well-rehearsed part of Japan's disaster response playbook, giving displaced residents a safe place to wait out the aftershocks rather than returning to homes inspectors hadn't yet cleared as structurally sound. Relief organizations that responded to the 2016 Kumamoto disaster and the 2011 Tohoku earthquake were already mobilizing supplies and personnel toward the region within hours, drawing on logistics networks built and refined across nearly a decade of responding to exactly this kind of emergency in exactly this part of the country. International response came quickly. Taiwan's president sent a message of condolences and announced that preparations for assistance were already underway, a gesture rooted in the two regions' shared experience with major earthquakes and their Heisei of supporting each other after past disasters. Reports of the shaking reached far beyond Kyushu itself, with people in parts of South Korea reporting that they felt the tremor and, in some cases, evacuating buildings as a precaution, even though the quake's damage was concentrated squarely in Kumamoto. The first images coming out of Kushima town told the story before a single official statement did. Aerial shots showed the Aeon Mall's roofline sagging inward where the second floor had given way, a jagged wound in an otherwise ordinary building that thousands of shoppers had walked through just hours earlier. Ground-level footage showed emergency crews in orange jumpsuits forming human chains across broken concrete, passing debris hand to hand rather than risking heavy machinery too close to a structure that hadn't yet been declared stable. Smoke, dust, and the flashing lights of a dozen emergency vehicles filled frame after frame. Drone footage released in the hours afterward showed the cracks running through nearby roads. Not potholes, but long fractures where the asphalt had been physically pulled apart along the fault's path, some wide enough to swallow a car tire. Photos from Cum. A motocastle showed fresh gaps in centuries-old stone walls, sections that had survived wars, weather, and the 2016 quake now showing new fault lines of their own. Video from a train platform captured the moment a Shinkansen came to an emergency stop, passengers gripping handrails as the platform lights flickered. None of these images needed captions to convey what had happened. That's often the case with a shallow, high-intensity earthquake. The visual evidence of the ground's violence is immediate and undeniable, even before scientists finish analyzing exactly what happened underground. It's worth asking plainly why this particular stretch of Kyushu seems to keep ending up at the center of Japan's earthquake story. Part of the answer is geography that can't be changed. Kumamoto sits close to where several active fault segments intersect, near the median tectonic line, one of the longest and most active fault systems in the country. When a region has that many stressed fault segments packed close together, energy released on one segment can shift the balance of stress on its neighbors, sometimes bringing them closer to their own breaking point. This is part of why seismologists don't treat 2016 and 2026 as two unrelated headlines a decade apart. They treat them as two chapters of the same ongoing process, a fault system working through a backlog of accumulated stress that built up over centuries, not just the 10 years since the last major rupture. In fault systems like this, a single human decade is a short window. The rock doesn't care how recently people rebuilt the last time. Beyond the immediate rescue effort, the practical weight of recovery is already becoming clear. Insurance assessors, structural engineers, and local government officials will spend the coming weeks going building by building across the prefecture, red tagging homes too damaged to re-enter and green tagging those safe enough for residents to return to. That process alone, after the 2016 sequence, took months to complete across the whole region. Supply chains matter here too. Kyushu is a significant manufacturing hub, home to semiconductor plants, automotive parts suppliers, and other industries that depend on stable power, water, and transportation to keep running. A suspended rail network and a closed airport runway don't just inconvenience Trav. Leers. They ripple into freight schedules, factory shift changes, and delivery timelines that extend well beyond the prefecture's own borders. Japanese authorities are acutely aware of this economic dimension, which is part of why getting transportation infrastructure re-inspected and reopened safely, rather than quickly, has been treated as such a priority in the first days after the quake. Officials and outside seismologists alike are watching a short list of things closely right now. First, the aftershock sequence itself, whether the frequency and strength of aftershocks decline in the pattern typical of most sequences, or whether a cluster of unusually strong aftershocks suggests stress is still redistributing in a way that could produce another significant rupture. Second, the volcanic monitoring around Sakurajima and Mount Aso, purely as a precaution grounded in decades of prior data, not because an eruption is expected. Third, the landslide risk in Kumamoto's hillier terrain, especially if the Mufteteki region sees rain in the days following the quake, since saturated slopes loosened by shaking can fail well after the ground has otherwise gone quiet. And fourth, the final confirmed casualty and damage figures, which will take time to firm up as search teams clear the last of the rubble and engineers complete formal structural surveys across the prefecture. None of these are reasons for alarm on their own. They're simply the standard checklist that follows any earthquake of this size and shallowness, wherever in the world it happens to strike. For the people living through it right now, the priorities are simple and urgent. Get people out of the collapsed mall, restore power to tens of thousands of homes, get transportation running again safely, and stay alert for aftershocks that authorities say could keep coming hard for the next several days. Longer term, this region faces the same grinding, expensive road Kumamoto walked after 2016. Rebuilding homes, repairing infrastructure, restoring a castle that has already survived 4 centuries of history and just took another hit. If there's a single lesson underneath all of this, it isn't a mysterious one. It's the same lesson seismologists have repeated for decades in Japan and everywhere else that sits on an active fault. Earthquakes cannot be predicted with precision. Not the day, not the hour, not the exact location of the next one. What can be done, and what clearly saved lives here, is preparating. ION. Strict building codes, drilled evacuation routines, tsunami warning systems that can issue an alert and lift it within 2 hours once the danger has genuinely passed. Nuclear safety protocols checked immediately, every single time, without exception. None of it stops a fault from rupturing. All of it determines how many people walk away afterward. Kumamoto has been here before, and it came back. The scenes coming out of Kyushu right now are hard to watch, and the people still searching that mall for survivors, and the families waiting for word on someone missing, deserve every bit of attention this story can bring them. Keep watching the aftershock warnings over the next few days. Keep watching the rescue updates from that mall. And if you want to understand how a country doesn't just survive an earthquake like this, but rebuild stronger from it, look at what Kumamoto did after 2016, because it's very likely the same road this region is about to walk all over again.